recording and start introducing Yue. So Yue is an assistant professor at the Department of Kinesiology and Sport Management at Texas A&M. Before that, he was a research associate at Johns Hopkins. I think he was working with Adrian Hayes, and before that, I think he was working with Jane Clark, I think at University of Maryland, correct me if I'm wrong. And then Yue has been looking at multiple areas of the cognitive and computational principles of motor behavior. He's looked at lifespan development of skill learning, timing perception, mechanical reasoning, and habit formation. And at Texas A&M, he leads the THINCMO Lab. And yeah, I'm very excited to hear from Yue today about his recent work. He's only just joined the department, he tells me, in August. So I'm very appreciative that he's taken the time to talk to us about his new work. So yeah, without further ado, I'll let Yue start.
Okay, so everybody can hear me clearly? Yeah, okay, so thanks, Polian, for the introduction. I'm Yue Du, you can call me Yue. Now, currently, I'm a director of the THINCMO Lab at Texas A&M University. And thanks for inviting me today to share my work with all of you. This work was done while I was at Johns Hopkins working with Adrian Hayes, and this paper recently published. This talk and this paper is majorly focusing on habit formation in human experiments. Okay, so once I say the word habit, right, some of you may already start to thinking about what habit you have. So let me share some of my habits, and I believe that some of you may share the same habit with me. So I have a bad habit. So every time I say writing a paper, okay, I drink coffee a lot. No matter how many cup of coffee I already drink, once I sit and write in paper, I drink a coffee. So this is one type of habit that we have in our life, right? So even though we know the bad consequence, we still persistently perform that behavior. So, and another habit I have is while I was not becoming a PI yet, I have a lot of pressure. So every time before I start working, I check my social media, I check email, I check news, check Google Scholar before I really start working on like serious stuff, right? So that's another kind of a habit we call life routine, right? It could be similar to like you go to gym every 5 days every week. But these two types of habit actually are kind of farther away from motor skills, right? When we're talking about motor skills, most type of movement we perform is fast, is effortless, right? And sometimes inflexible. So here comes the third types of habit that we'll focus on here, which we call it slips of action. Okay, imagine a scenario, okay? You get a new phone and the configuration of the phone, like the apps, the positions are totally new to you. So once you want to use an app like Google Map, right? How you do it, right? You slide your finger and deliberately looking at the screen and try to find where the Google Map icon is, right? And then hit the button. But once you use the same phone without changing the configuration for years, right? Everything becomes easier. You just take out the phone, slide on the phone screen, on an autopilot mode without much thinking, and then immediately click the button, right? You have. So everything happens effortless, fast. But this type of behavior actually comes at a cost, right? Some days you add a lot of apps, you delete a lot of apps like I did recently because I joined a new place and the configuration changed. So the app you want to actually change the location. But one day you probably in rush or you probably didn't pay much attention. You just pull out your phone, try to find Google Map and you slide your finger on the phone again without much thinking, and then you hit the location actually the app was before the configuration changes. Okay, so we call this is slips of action. And this type of behavior again is fast, triggered by the stimulus, and also you can perform effortless, but comes at a cost of being inflexible. And this behavior traditionally explained by automatic stimulus response association, which simply the response is automatically triggered by the stimulus. Okay, so the question is how we review, how we establish this type of behavior in human experiments. The common paradigm, a task we use, we call arbitrary visual motor association task. You can have different names, but basically the idea is we learn association between different visual cues and different responses. In this case, there are four cues and four responses. Each cue is associated with one corresponding response. So in this task, at a time, only one symbol show up on the screen, and we need to respond or press the corresponding key as quickly as you can. Okay. And after a certain amount of practice, how we review habit is through two approaches. The first approach we call response remapping approach. So we swap two symbols. Now these two symbols associate with new responses. So for example, if you see the E shape, originally it's associated with the rightmost key, but now it becomes associated with the second key from the left, right? And using this method, one study in the lab at Johns Hopkins, the previous lab I was in, successfully and reliably review habit formation and the practice effect of habit formation. What do I mean practice effect is once the habit is established, the habit strength can increase with more practice. Okay. And the other method people commonly use is called with response withholding. So instead of swap one pair of stimulus, okay, now what we need to do is withhold our response once we see one of those symbols. Okay, if they become habitual based on the stimulus response association hypothesis, then if they become habitual, even though you instruct them to withhold the response, once they see this symbol, they still generate that response by pressing this particular key. Okay, by using this method, the consistent of revealing habits in human experiment is not consistent. Some study actually find out the habit, but some didn't. And for those who successfully found out the habit using this withholding approach, they do not reveal the practice effect on habit strength, which means once you establish habit, the habit strength does not increase with practice. So this causes the inconsistency in the literature by using these two paradigms. Okay, so the overarching purpose of this paper is try to find out what factors causes this consistent results between these two paradigms. So if we look closely into those experiments using these two approaches, we found that there are some methodological differences. For example, in the remapping approach, especially the paper done previously by Adrian Hayth and other people, normally the practice amount of volume is large, okay, typically larger than 1,000 trials of practice. And then we also force participants to respond rapidly in this task. Okay, I will go to more details about what do we mean by forced to respond rapidly later. And then use the remapping approach, as we mentioned before, we change the stimulus response association directly. We just swap one pair of stimuli, right? But in the withholding approach, okay, normally experiment just to conduct 500 trials of practice at the most. Okay. And also they do not force participants to respond rapidly. They just instruct people to respond as quickly as they can. But we know in that instruction, people still have the freedom to delay their response, especially once they become cautious to prioritize accuracy, right? And also another difference we will not go into detail is that they do not change the stimulus response association directly. Instead, they change that association by a method called reward devaluation. Okay, through the outcome, not directly change the mapping. Okay, so these are differences in the methods they use. But we think, okay, it's not about the methods. It's about the approach itself, like the remapping and the withholding approach, right? So we argue that for the remapping approach, especially when you ask people to respond rapidly or force them to respond quickly, right? The only decision they can make in this paradigm is what to act, what key you're going to press. They don't have the freedom to withhold their response at all, right? So we call this response preparation. However, on top of that, when you instruct people to withhold the response, they have another decision to make, which is decide whether to act or not. Okay, so we argue that this two approach itself, okay, regardless of what's the manipulation on the methods, that they tag on different aspects of responses. Okay, so what would be the habit of response preparation, habit response initiation, and how could they be different? So according to the traditional information processing model, we know, right, that response initiation is immediately triggered by response selection. So based on this model, you see that if we want, once we build the response selection, which I think I will equivalize that to response preparation. Once we have a habit of response preparation, then it will initiate it automatically immediately trigger the habitual initiation response, right? So they are not independent from each other. However, as we know, most of you may already know this, that we have converging evidence that shows response preparation and response initiation are independent processes, right? This is intuitive if we're talking about self-initiated movement. Like I'm already prepared to go to gym after this talk, but I will not initiate that response until I finish this talk, right? So I prepare something, but I don't initiate it immediately. So they are independent. And this converging evidence actually show that the independence of preparation and initiation actually exists even in reactive tasks that require very fast responses. Okay, so based on this evidence, we hypothesize that, okay, because they are independent, perhaps their habit formation is independent too. Okay, so in this particular study, we're gonna match all of these methodological details. Okay, match all of them between the remapping and withholding of groups, and then directly examine whether we can observe distinct behavior pattern. Okay, under the remapping and withholding group. Okay, so here's comes with the hypothesis. Once we match those three conditions, right? It's possible that we observe slips of action habit in both approaches. And this will support the hypothesis that yes, the habitual behavior we observe is driven by the same automatic stimulus response association, right? But how about if we observe habitual preparation like we did before, but not slips of action habit in withholding approach? Right? So this would allow us to suggest that this two type of approach actually probe different types of habit, namely habitual preparation and habitual initiation. Okay, so before we dive into the details of experiment, I'm gonna give you some technical details about how we force participant to respond rapidly in this task. Okay, so we still use the AVMA task, but on top of that, we use one so-called forced reaction time approach. So instead of ask participant to respond as quickly as they can, now every trial, they hear 4 beeps, evenly spaced. And their job, what they need to do is always press the key, synchronize on the last beep. Okay, so we fix the time of response. Instead, we manipulate when we're gonna show the symbol on the screen. Okay, it could be as early as the first beep, which give us a lot of time to make the decision, or it could show up on the last beep, which give you no time at all to make the decision. Okay, so we can let the symbol show at any random time between the first beep and the last beep. Okay, so we call that time, the time allow them to make the response as allowed reaction time. Okay, and then for each allowed reaction time, we can observe which response they make in response to a particular symbol. Okay, so let's focus again the E-shaped symbol here, right? If you see, when we give them a long enough allowed reaction time, they can almost always press the correct key, which is the blue key here. Okay. But if you give them short amount of time, for example, before shorter than 300 milliseconds, right? They kind of random guess one of those 4 keys here. And in the middle, between 300 to, let's say, 1000, sometimes they press the right key, sometimes they press the wrong key, right? So based on this raw data, we can use the sliding window, for example, 100 millisecond, to calculate the probability of selecting the right key, okay, within each time window. So here it allows us to construct the speed accuracy trade-off. And the advantage for this method is that we are not only able to construct the probability profile for the correct response, right? We can construct the probability profile for other response as well. For example, both the response, the orange response and the blue response start from the chance level, which is 25% at this case. And the correct response gradually probability increase with a longer reaction time. But then the wrong key, which is the orange key, the probability gradually decrease to zero as the allowed reaction time increases. Okay, so by using this method, the forced reaction time approach, combined with the remapping approach, our lab and other labs successfully and reliably review human habits, slips of action in experimental settings. So this is the paradigm we use, as you already know. And after a certain amount of practice on the original mapping, we swap one pair of the stimuli. Okay. And we ask the participant to use this revised mapping to perform the forced reaction time task. And under that task, right, we can have three different types of response. One is, let's again focus on the E-shaped ladder here. If you see the E-shaped ladder, the first type of response you can make is the habitual response, which is the correct key according to the original mapping you practiced, right? And second type of response is the correct response, which is the current key that is associated with the E-shaped ladder according to the revised mapping, right? And the other two keys we call is other random errors, which are those two keys that are never associated with a particular symbol under either the original mapping and the revised mapping. Okay, so we're going to construct this probability profile for all these three types of responses. So here comes the condition that when participants do not have practice at all on the original mapping, we call it the minimal condition, okay? All three types of response, the blue one, the correct one, red one is the habitual error, yellow is the other error. Okay, all three types of response start from the chance level, which is 25% accuracy. Okay, and with longer allowed reaction time, the correct response probability gradually increase as we expected. Okay, but whenever they fail to select this correct key, they have equal likelihood to select the habitual error and the random keys, which means they do not have a strong tendency preferring the habitual key over the random keys. Okay, this is the indicator that they do not establish habit at all. But this pattern actually changed once we asked participants practice over 1,000 trials. You see the red curve, which is the habitual error probability, and the yellow curve, which is the random error, other error probability, start to diverge. Okay, and the difference between this red curve and yellow curve suggests that they form a habit of the original mapping because they have a strong tendency to press the original key they practiced over the other two random keys they do not have practice on, right? So this is the signal. The difference is the signal that habit formation is successful. Okay, and the divergence actually gets larger and larger with more and more practice. Okay, and there's two things to worth noting here is that even though the habit becomes stronger and stronger, they always take places within a specific time window, which is when the allowed reaction time is around between 300 milliseconds to 600 milliseconds. Okay, this is why we have to force participants to respond quickly to review habit. Because if you look at 100, if the reaction time is larger than 1000 milliseconds, right, we still have some tiny amount of habitual error, but it's not all the habitual error they could produce, right? If you look at here, they have just maybe 5% of error is a habitual error, right? If you allow them enough reaction time. And also, if you compare the practice condition, there's no difference. There's no practice effect if you give them the same amount of long enough reaction time. Okay, so ask them to respond in a self-paced manner, cannot review habits, and also cannot review the practice effect of habit. Okay, so this is how useful this forced reaction time paradigm is to help us review habits in human experiments, which actually has proven to be very difficult before this paradigm come out. Some study find out the habit, but again, like the error rate is just like at the 5% level. It's not like 60% level as we show here. Okay, so now you're clear with the all the technical details, right? So we come back to this hypothesis we have. Now we're gonna conduct the experiment to match all of these conditions between the remapping paradigm and the withholding paradigm and to see what we found. So in experiment one, again, we train people the AVMA task, okay? We train them around 1,000 trials, okay? But before this practice and after practice, we test the performance to make sure the performance is consistent between these remapping and withholding groups. Okay. After the practice 1,000 trials to probe habitual preparation, again, we use the remapping method. And to probe habitual initiation, we use the withholding approach. Okay. The reason here we use A symbols but 4 responses is that even in the withholding group, okay, in the revised mapping, they still need to use all of those 4 keys. So they cannot completely shut down one finger at all. Okay. All right, so for this reverse mapping, we only ask them to learn this mapping, and then immediately after we test their habit. Okay, so what we observed. So for the remapping, you already know this pattern, right? Habitual error, other error, correct error. So what we observed is that we see the divergence between the red curve and the yellow curve here, which indicate, okay, after 1,000 try to practice, participants in the remapping group show habitual behavior, which we argue that it's habitual preparation as suggested by our previous paper. What about with the holding group, right? So if you look at the pattern, the red curve and the yellow curve are actually very similar, indicating there's no habit at all, even though they can habitually prepare the response, right? But they still are able to flexibly prevent themselves from generating that habitually prepared response. Okay. One technical issue here is that in principle, we only have 2 choices in the withholding group, which is make a press or no, not make a key press, right? So we do not directly observe the baseline, which is a yellow profile here. We use the mathematical model to construct this baseline, which resembles the probability of initiated response given no habit formed. Okay. All right, so this is just a visualization. Then we use some statistical model and to quantify the difference between these 2 groups. Okay, so this curve basically is the difference between the red curve and the yellow curve. So the green here is the remapping group, and the brown here is the withholding group. You see the difference is very obvious and it's statistically different. And here we use the raw data because sliding window, you can change the sliding window, the width of the sliding window. So that may slightly affect the statistical analysis results. So instead of using this continuous curve, we use the raw data as we show in the toy example about how we construct the speed-x trade-off. We calculate the probability of the habit, okay, within certain time window of the reaction time, allowed reaction time. Okay, and worth noting here is, besides we compare the remapping group and withholding group, we also recruit a withholding minimal group, which is they do the withholding approach, but do not practice the original mapping at all, right? We know habit is a product of practice. So we want to see whether the withholding group we have here share the similar behavior pattern with the withholding minimum group. And it turns out they're very similar, okay? Which further suggests that the withholding group they do not show behavior, habitual behavior, even though under time pressure. Okay. All right. So this is just the computation model. I think we can skip off this. So basically, this first study showed that response preparation, but not response to initiation, become habitual after about 1,000 trials of practice. Okay, but there's a confounding factor, which is the intrinsic difference between these two approaches. We um, didn't notice. Okay, before the reviewer actually raised this concern about our first experiment, which is there is some intrinsic task difficulty difference between these two approaches. Okay, for the remapping group, right? If you consider the revised mapping, we swap two pairs of stimuli, which make the participant to memorize those four symbols that were remapped, as well as the four responses that become associated with this remapping, right? So let's consider this 8 element they need to learn. But in the withholding group, what they need to memorize is only those four symbols and the one response, which is do not act. And also the new things is here, the no response is not included in the original mapping, right? The original mapping response is just 4 keys, and the do not response is not included in the practice. So this difficulty difference actually can have a same consequence from two distinct reasons, right? So the easier mapping, the revised mapping, actually allows quicker goal-directed control. So which means they can prepare for the new response quickly, which potentially will suppress the habitual response, right? In the withholding group. And another reason is the difficult revised mapping in the remapping condition actually may introduce confusion to participants. The confusion can possibly induce behavior that look like a habit, but not reflect a genuine habit at all, right? So to overcome this problem, we come up with the second experiment, which we keep withholding group exactly the same as the experiment 1, but we revise the remapping group. In this case, we ask the participant to press a single key once they see those four symbols. And importantly, this key is not included in the original mapping. Okay, so this manipulation allow us to match this difficulty level between these two approaches as much as possible. Okay, so we're gonna see what's the behavior pattern under this new experiment. And besides this manipulation, we also included the minimum practice group and the extensive practice group for each approaches. Okay, here in order the reason why we include the minimal group is that we want to establish that if we observe habit in the extensive group, it's not caused by confusion. Okay, if confusion is the major reason, we should also observe habit-like behavior in the minimal practice group. Okay, if their behavior diverge, then the habitual behavior we observed will reflect the practice established, the habit established by habit. Okay. All right. So this is the result. This is not surprising. Under minimum condition, okay, under the remapping approach, there's no habit because these two curves is not significantly diverging from one another. And also we replicate the experiment 1 results. Under the minimum training condition, the withholding group also do not show habitual behavior. Okay, but perhaps this is also not surprising. After extensive practice, the remapping group show habit as we showed before, even though we changed the task difficulty in the remapping group. Okay, and again, this replicate the previous results, experiment 1 results. Even after extensive practice, withholding group do not show habitual behavior. Okay, so under these 4 groups, only in this group, okay, extensive practice under the remapping approach demonstrate habitual behavior. All right. Okay. So these results allow us to say that, okay, response provision can become habitual earlier than initiation. And this difference is not caused by task difficulty. Okay. All right. Now, as from the experiment one, experiment two, we sort of provide evidence that support the second hypothesis, right? We do not observe sleeps of action in withholding approach, which suggests that these two methods actually measure habit associated with different aspects of response action control, namely habitual preparation and habitual initiation. Okay. Then the question we want to answer is, can response initiation be habitual at all? We don't know that, right? So intuitively, experiment three, this is the question we want to answer. But intuitively, the manipulation would be, as we know, habit is the outcome of practice. So we just increase the amount of practice and see whether people become habitually initiated response or not, right? We can train people 10,000 trials, 20,000 trials. People actually did this before, right? But the problem is we don't know how much is enough. So it's kind of we play a trick here. Instead of doing extensive practice, okay, we want to find something that's already established through life experience. For example, some mapping have strong stimulus response compatibility, right? And this type of compatibility already been found that it can induce automatic processing, right? For example, this mapping has strong spatial stimulus response compatibility. Once you see one, I mean, it's very intuitive and automatically that you will press the leftmost key, right? This has been proved largely in the literature. So we're going to use this mapping instead to replicate the experiment one to see whether people in the with the holding group can generate a habitual behavior or not. Okay, so here is the remapping group. Again, this is what we expected, right? They show strong habit here, which is a large difference between the red curve and the yellow curve. And for the with the holding group, we successfully observed the divergence between the habitual response and the other random response, okay, which is the baseline here. So we successfully reveal, yes, initiation can be habitual by using this pre-established visual motor association. Okay, here just to show you the some statistical analysis as we did before, and all this evidence and the modeling, all this evidence confirm, yes, initiation with the holding group actually generate a habitual behavior. Okay, so taken together these three experiments, we established that this dissociable type of habits related to response preparation and response initiation. But I would say so far it's just dissociation at the behavior level, right? You could assume, yes, their behavior dissociable. There may be two distinct underlying habit process that support each of them respectively. But it's also reasonable to suggest that this two habitual behavior pattern is driven by the same habitual preparation process. What do I mean? Is that maybe there's only one process, right? Through practice, you make it habitual, but that's not strong enough to trigger the initiation. It's only strong enough to trigger preparation. But once you get more practice, right? Once the habitual preparation becomes stronger and reaches a certain level, it can trigger the initiation. Okay, so the same process can trigger both of this type of behavior, habitual behavior, right? But so this is intuitive and very possible by visualize our experiment results between experiment one and experiment three. Okay, experiment one we know we observe habit, right? In remapping group, no habit with the holding group. But in experiment three, we observe initiation the habit in the with the holding group, right? But at the same time, the strength of the habit in the remapping group is also much larger than the habit we observed in experiment one, which actually kind of suggests this single habit process hypothesis, right? If you have a habitual preparation, but it's not strong enough to trigger initiation, you don't have an initiation habit, right? But once it's strong enough, it can trigger the habitual initiation, right? So we take a deeper look at our data And one consequence given this hypothesis, single habit process hypothesis is that if habitual preparation gonna trigger initiation, then the preparation at least cannot happen later than initiation, right? So we compare the preparation and the initiation speed within participants. And here is just an exemplar participants data. Red curve is the preparation speed x trade-off. Blue curve represent the speed x trade-off of initiation. Okay, initiation has a better speed x trade-off than preparation. And this pattern is consistent across all the experiment we did. Okay, no matter whether participant become habitually initiate response or not. In experiment 3, they become habitually initiate response, but the initiation speed is faster than preparation speed. And for other experiments where participants in the withholding group do not become habitual, their initiation speed is also faster than preparation speed. Okay, so this data actually is contradict with the consequence um, from the single habit process hypothesis, right? And we also, in addition to that, we also consider two computational models, right? In one model, we assume the preparation and the initiation habit are independent. So we assume they happen different time. You can habitually prepare response, but do not initiate, or you can habitually initiate response without preparation. Okay, so this model actually, this is some example data and the model fitting of that data. One feature of this model is that you see once they start to habitually initiate the response, they are not only generating the prepared one, they also generate the other random errors. Okay, this is the evidence that they can initiate the habitual response. They can habitually initiate response without preparation. Okay. In contrast, this model, in the second model, we assume there's only one habit process, which is habitual preparation. And this habitual preparation process, as we said before, once it reach a level, it can automatically trigger the initiation of the prepared response. And this is the exemplar participant data and the model fitting. And the difference here is that once they start to generate habitually initiated response, all the response they initiate is the prepared one. Okay, they do not generate the other error at all. Okay, so we feed these two models to all our individual data of those participants that show initiation habit in the withholding groups. And we feed this model to all those individual cross experiments. And we found most of those participant data actually favor the independent model instead of the dependent model. Okay. And by using this model, we also confirm that the speed difference between initiation and the preparation is not consistent. The preparation is not consistently preceding initiation. You see the speed difference is half participant actually has faster initiation, the other half has faster preparation. Okay, so this results actually suggest, okay, maybe there's not only one habitual process that driven these two behavior patterns. Okay, there are two independent habitual process which triggers those two different behavior patterns. So this is our conclusion that habitual initiation was not caused by strong habitual preparation. And thus, in addition to the behavior dissociability, they are likely mechanistically dissociable as well. Okay, so to wrap up my the study, basically what we found is that these two approach tap on different aspects of a response, namely response preparation, response initiation, and the habit of those two aspects of action control can happen at different time and dissociably. Okay, and this paper actually will lead to many open questions for us in our future research. One is the difference between how you manipulate the revised mapping, right? Traditional study in human experiment where they want to review habit is that they directly translate the rodent paradigm to human participants, which use the outcome devaluation, right? You perform an action and then I just devalue the outcome. then you learn that revised mapping between the response and the outcome. And then once again, I put you into the same situation, same stimulus, and to test whether your behavior is sensitive to the outcome devaluation or not, right? And we are in our recent review, we actually argue this outcome devaluation in human participants has some limitations. For example, you don't know what is the real outcome of the participants, right? And you don't know whether you can completely devalue the outcome they care or not, right? Okay, so this current study I'm presenting, in addition to previous study we have, show that directly changing the stimulus response association does the work. Using this instruction-based stimulus response revision, we can successfully review habit in human experiments. Okay, but it still remains possible that these two approaches, like remapping with holding, these two approaches changing SR directly or changing SR by outcome devaluation could tap on different type of habit. One is slips of action we are referring here. The other one may be more like the drinking coffee while writing example, right? We know the outcome is bad, but we still do it. Okay, we still do it once in the same context. So perhaps these two approaches tap on different types of habits. And this is a question we aim to answer in the future. And second one is this study actually provides strong evidence supporting our argument. Again, we raised in this recent review is that we cannot view habit as a stimulus response association as a whole at the response level. We have to view habit at the intermediate computation level of response. For example, each response has different aspects, right? Initiation, preparation, different speed, different trajectory, all those parameters can become habitual. So we suggest that we should view habit at those level instead of at the response level. Okay, because this study, we show strong evidence suggesting that even though the same behavioral pattern you can observe, they may be driven by different underlying habitual process, right? Okay, so another question we didn't address is whether there's a practice effect on response initiation, right? We use the mapping with a strong stimulus response association compatibility instead of manipulating the practice volume. So this is another question, an interesting question to answer in the future to see whether practice can change the strength of initiation habit or not. Last question is the focus of research in my current lab, which is actually the remapping and withholding strategy is two important strategy used in applied setting to help people break bad habits, right? You can imagine once you have a habit, one method you can use to completely withhold the response, use your intention, right? The other one is to use some good behavior to replace the bad behavior. Like if you want to quit smoking, right? You just eat some candy or chew gums. Use new response to replace the old habit, which is more like the remapping paradigm. Okay, so this experiment manipulation actually provide us more well-controlled experiment environment condition to dive into these two apply strategies used for habit extinction. Okay, so that will conclude my talk. So I welcome any comments and questions.
Thank you so much for a great talk. Do we have any questions? Yep, Tim.
Thanks. Yeah, I've got one. So I think I generally agree with most of the things that you've talked about. I guess one thing that's a little grey to me is the idea of preparation and initiation prior to preparation. So if the sensorimotor state is such that there is nothing ready to be done, you can't initiate it, right? So you're talking about preparing the specific action which is cued, the goal-directed action in terms of your preparation, but there may be other preparatory processes going on within the central motor system that also contribute to the initiation step. So I do think that there's definitely some degree of dissociation, but I'm not sure if I would agree that they could be entirely independent. So, I mean, you can't initiate something if there's nothing in the system ready to release, right? So that's still possible that you have, you're preparing something already, you're anticipating, you're guessing that something might be coming up. There's a state of preparation. The neural state is such that you're leaning towards one action rather than another. And then what you're seeing then is a shift potentially to the goal-directed one. But maybe that combination of preparing the anticipated one and the goal-directed one is giving you some degree of activation, which then leads to the trigger signal. So, I guess it's just something to consider. I'm not sure what you think about that.
No, I agree. I agree with you. They are not completely independent, right? In most cases, yes, we generate response once we are ready. But I would argue, especially, I mean, that perhaps is true before they become habitual, right? But once they become habitual, they habitually always prepare the right one. That's why we call this habitual, right? The stimulus triggers the response you practice a lot. So
Well, I mean, before 300 milliseconds, they release something else. So they've presumably prepared something else at that point randomly. Because
right,
if you're sleeping and someone puts up a sign, you don't respond.
Yeah,
right?
it could be.
So you can still hit your retina, but you won't respond. So
yeah, I agree with you. So, but if you look at, so I'm not sure I'm right. I'm not 100% I'm right. But if you look at the random period here, if we give them a short reaction time, yes, it actually can trigger the one they prepare, but the one they prepare maybe it's not the correct one.
yeah,
So that's
absolutely,
possible. Yeah, that's definitely possible. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess it just really depends what you mean by preparation, right? So
Right.
obviously
Right.
you're talking about the preparing the target and the goal-directed response. But if you're talking just generally about motor preparation, then I would argue that the system is doing motor preparation prior to that point, and then any stimulus is releasing what's been prepared in advance.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, we always prepare something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
John?
Yeah, thanks, Yuri. That was a great talk. I was just related to that. I was just interested in some of your modeling on some of the last slides there, and looking at those very early time windows. As you get close to zero, and your modeling often suggests that people are 100% correct, and that sort of seems to deviate from that idea that when you give people very little time, they're choosing a random option from the available options. I just wondered if you could explain why that's it looks like that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So I didn't mention this. So if you look at the original data, yeah, let's stay here, right? In the remapping group, yes, because the chance of each response, which is 4 response, are equally likely, right? So in the remapping group, yes, the random guess, one of those, which will make the chance level at 25% level. But that's interesting. In the withholding group, they have actually the bias at very short reaction time. They're gonna withhold the response because they have 50% chance to be correct if they do not press the ending key. If they press the key, they only have, let's say, 1/5, 20% chance to be right. Right. So I mean, our observation is they prefer to don't do anything. And this is also true for experiment 2 in the remapping group, right? Let me show you this. Yeah, the remapping group you see here, if we change the mapping, the 4 symbols associated with one single key here, they also have the bias to always press the new key instead of one of those old keys. So they have a strong tendency. It's not as a chance of. So the chance level doesn't really mean they're guessing something. It's just chance level is just when they do not have time to respond. What's the bias? So
yeah, so I understand that. So if you have, as you said in that example, they have a 20% chance of getting it right if they press a button. So you would expect it to average out at about 80% withdrawal. That would be the statistics of the situation, and so they tend towards that. But in your model, it looks like they're at 100%.
Well, okay. Let me see. Right. In this case, yes. Maybe you're handpicking this example, which show the best to show our data fitting here. There are two, they do, we have in the paper, we have supplementary figures which show the individual data for every single individual. Some people actually do have 100% level
Yeah,
bias.
it's just that I'm just wondering if this idea, because this is the modeling on which you're basing the decision to about what's going on in the brain, is it one one sort of process that's going on, or are there two processes going on? And I just wonder if it changes the situation if you incorporate that idea that there's some statistical based choice going on in those very short time frames, because in one case, you mentioned that the increase in the off-target or non-habitual options in the first case was kind of key to that decision about whether you're choosing one model over the other. And so I wonder if you incorporate that, maybe you do see some not off-target choices being made if they're not at 100% at very short time frames.
Oh, we actually included that parameter in our model. So for every single reaction time, we consider all possible responses they can make, like considering whether they have the bias or not. So it's basically it's a normative probabilistic model, right? When the allowed reaction time is, for example, below the time they need, we assume for each type of response they can make, we assign a probability parameter to that type of response. We do consider that in our model.
Okay.
Yeah, hopefully
Thanks very
that
much.
answers your question. Maybe I didn't quite understand your question.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. That is helpful.
Maybe relating to that question, I think in the first set of results that you showed us, do you mind skipping forward to that? I was just stuck in wondering why the habit doesn't show in this more prominently in the less than 300 millisecond period. Why is there why does it need to occur at this bump within the, I don't know, 200 to 300? Why is there this consistent bump? I think not this set, and maybe was this the earliest set of results? Yeah.
Yeah, this is experiment one result.
Yeah.
So yes, so previously, as we said, right, it happens in a certain time window. Looks like this experiment actually has a later habit, right? They happen like around 400 milliseconds, 450 to, let's say the hugest amount is about 800, right? And the previous experiment, we always observe habit between 300 and 600 milliseconds. The reason here is that there's more symbols for them to consider. So it's kind of like a Higgs law. So we do observe when you have more responses, right? The habit will happen at later allowed reaction time. So which kind of makes sense. And another thing doesn't make sense is, I mean, if they become habitual, right? It's supposed to be automatic. Then it should happen, quickly as like, for example, between 300 to 600 milliseconds. But we do observe it here. So in a new study, we haven't published that yet. We're writing the paper, is that we found, actually there's a preprint. We found that this so-called habitual behavior actually is not 100% equivalent to being automatic. So we assume this is kind of like they still have some effort for retrieving process in their memory, but even though the behavior become habitual. But when we see automatic behavior, it's like kind of like, yes, stimulus will trigger the response. No matter how many responses you have, it will trigger in the same speed, right? So that's Higgs law and automaticity. But we do find, yes, this is a bit different from that type of behavior. That's why we observe like some later habit.
But I ask if you've been speculating about what you think the different mechanisms for the trigger signal versus the preparation. I mean, I'm assuming that you're thinking it's, preparatory state and, motor cortex and premotor cortex for the preparation and maybe something basal ganglia for trigger that's related. That's all. I mean, obviously you got the other off-axis, independent components in the motor areas as well, but you would, yeah. So what are you thinking?
So yeah, I'm not a neuro person, but I have my guess. So traditionally, people think habit is in basal ganglia, right? So that's kind of like the site habit resides. But we argue that, I mean, from this evidence and the review we wrote, the general like the intermediate computation habit underlying response, we assume that, I mean, if a different aspect of response can become habitual, then habit of those aspects can locate at different area of the brain. So that's our guess. It can locate in cortex if it's about movement parameter, right? It can reside in basal ganglia if for example, it's about vigor or other things related to basal ganglia. So yeah, that's my guess. But again, I'm not a neuro person, so
Oh,
I'll ask a question. So you talked about in your final slide I guess from like a what was it more um maybe an applied perspective, when you do swaps between a habit and a replacement response, based on your habit data, I guess you would suggest that that is potentially less effective at because you're more habitual with fewer practice trials, and that's kind of going against all of the self-help habit books, bad habit books, I suppose.
yeah.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could, speculate on that and how
That's a good question. So, I mean, we don't know the answer yet. We don't know whether the outcome devaluation is effective or not in human experiment because they always use the outcome devaluation paradigm combined with the holding approach. So there are just a few, one or two experiments use the outcome devaluation in the remapping approach. They do review habit in human subject. So it's hard to say whether it's the effect of the outcome effectiveness of the outcome devaluation or not. But we do argue, like you said, right? Outcome devaluation, I mean, there's limitations. I mean, as I mentioned, you don't know what is the goal of participant. Yeah, you give them money feedback, you give them some figures as the positive outcome, but you don't know whether they care about it or not, right? If you devaluate that, I mean, you don't know whether you devalue the true outcome they care about or not. So it's really hard to determine, but I think it's worth studying. Let's compare these two paradigms in the
yeah.
future.
I do remember reading the kind of outcome evaluation papers that, some of them, they really take the rodent model and they give, whatever snack they use and until satiation or until people hate the snack. Yeah, that's not what your undergrad cares about. They typically, my opinion of what the undergrad cares about is getting out of the experiment as soon as possible. That's just my
Yeah,
own.
that's their goal. So you should evaluate our goal instead of eating the snack, right?
So you should make your participants stay, regardless of how quickly they completed, to stay in the lab for as long as possible. Um, yeah. The so I was kind of just wondering what you thought about um because I noticed that you have during your PhD work you're doing quite a few motor sequence learning studies, and the typical paradigm is where you have your sequence, you learn the sequence, and in theory you chunk it and then you switch to random. Um, and very tangentially related to that, there was a recent study published in eLife that found that people have this thank you everyone, for coming. But yeah, so it was a paper published by Trevor Robbins that found that people who have OCD engage in more sequence learning practice trials. Were you aware of that study? And can no?
No, I'm not aware of that study.
So
I should look at.
yeah, they basically had people learn a sequence learning task in an app, and then they found that people who had OCD, reported symptom relief. So doing this, I guess, replacement compulsive practice task seemed to offer them symptomatic relief, and they also self-engaged in more practice for I think it was the more severe, no, yeah, the ones who reported more symptom relief self-selected in larger volumes of practice. Anyway, yeah, I thought, say if you were writing a grant, I wondered what you thought about how, say, your findings about habit linked to the way we typically study these types of sequence learning tasks where people ignore the transition from the sequence to the random. Yeah, just wondering if you have general thoughts about this different literature.
So I think it's kind of procedural learning, sequence learning, right? We kind of think if it's a serial reaction time, there's some evidence, especially for children, right? I have my own work also show this for children. Actually, they learn the model sequence in a serial reaction time task in a implicit way, right? They don't know, they cannot articulate the order, but their performance get better. I think there's a perhaps some confusion between implicit learning or procedural learning with a habit, right? Habit is a product of practice. You have to practice something many times to establish the habit. But procedural learning can actually happens at the beginning of the learning. So like the series sequence learning task. So they kind of different things. So yeah, it's kind of I don't agree that people dump habit and a skill into procedural memory. So it's kind of different things. But the kind of also related, in my opinion. So perhaps I don't know this, but it's an interesting question. It's like if they do have OCD, which is habit-like symptom, maybe they will use the procedural memory more when they start to learn something, right?
Yeah.
So my previous study actually found children kind of use procedural learning more than adults. And if you look at their behavior pattern in the sequence learning task, and yes, and my hypothesis and another study I already planned in the lab is we want to see whether children can, establish habit earlier using less
Oh,
practice than adults. So it's kind of yeah, similar to the study you mentioned.
yeah.
And yeah.
And that would make sense developmentally as well. I guess what I was wondering about is when, people often quantify sequence learning by looking at the difference between the last sequence block and then the first random block. And to me, it would seem like that's a swap, right? Maybe in a way, kind of a swap. Um,
Yeah. Oh,
so
that's a good point, actually. Yeah.
so people wouldn't have um I mean, people don't pay attention to accuracy typically, but you would have the accuracy drop as well. And you have the reaction time increase when you do that swap.
Oh,
Um,
that's a good point, actually. Yeah. Yes. So in the habit study, okay, which they observe similar phenomenon as what you described in sequence learning is that if we don't use the forced reaction time task, right? Even though they establish strong habit, you swap the mapping, and they do
mm,
not produce many errors. The only thing
mm,
you observe, they slow down.
yeah,
The
yeah,
reaction
yeah.
become much bigger. Yeah, much longer. Yeah, that's similar to the sequence learning. Yeah, perhaps sequence learning is they already established a habit
Oh,
and they
some habit like mechanisms are potentially,
that's an
um,
interesting point.
yeah. I'm aware that it is 1 hour past, and yeah, thank you so much for generously sharing your work with us. I will make the recording available on YouTube so that those who aren't here with us today can also share. Oh yeah, can also watch this presentation. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you. All right, see you later then.
Yeah,
Bye now.
bye.